Okay, it is 5 minutes past, and so it's my immense pleasure now to welcome Kate Phillips, who's going to give our talk today. Dr. Phillips is teaching on writing, argumentation, and technology at the University in Rochester, and she works on the role of technology in argumentation and also on virtue in argumentation, which is incredibly exciting stuff and so timely. More of us should probably know more about this. Today she's going to talk about argumentative agency in the age of AI. Please take it away, Kate.
Thank you. Can you all see my slides okay? All right, super. So I'm going to start with a quick overview and give the structure and then just get right into it. So my main claim today is that increasing technological supplementation of our intellectual processes and argumentative exchanges is limiting our argumentative agency. So this is really largely exploratory, and for full disclosure, I frequently wonder about the ways that we are generally alarmist about new technologies, which often seem to turn out to be just fine. Particularly, I often wonder if new technologies merely change the shape of our intellectual landscape, not really for better or for worse, but merely make it different. And so we need different strategies to get value out of them and avoid pitfalls. However, I do find myself skeptical of the intellectual benefits of emerging technologies. And in our current landscape, I believe that they have the potential to constrain our argumentative agency. So my conclusion is somewhat tentative, and I'm also going to suggest that perhaps emerging technologies like large language models and wearable smart devices, such as smart glasses and headsets, that will likely further integrate AI tools into our daily lives, are indeed likely to limit our argumentative agency, but perhaps rather than that being the end of the story, it might just raise some new questions about how we need to adapt. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my motivations, give a couple of definitions, talk about ways that I think technology infringes on argumentative agency, go over a few reasons for potential optimism, and then I'll conclude. All right, motivations. This is my favorite part of the talk right here, just this picture of pit bulls in space, which I will tell you why. So what initially sparked my interest in this topic was one of my early experiences with an image generator. When I first used DALL-E, while I was waiting for it to load, it told me about some ways that I could use it. It showed examples as suggestions, and one was pit bulls in space. And now that's all I ever seem to be able to think of generating with image generators, which, to be fair, might just signal something about my own lack of creativity, perhaps particularly with respect to visuals. A more serious motivation comes from interests I have as a teacher of first-year argumentative writing. So some of the challenges I often find teaching young writers are challenges with information literacy, so the ability to distinguish different kinds of sources and make nuanced judgments about their credibility, willingness to engage with objections to one's own views. Frequently, I interact with individuals, whether inside the classroom or out, whose conception of argument revolves around proving a point rather than exchanging reasons in search of the best conclusions. And also sometimes I find with my students, it seems somewhat paradoxical considering what I just said, but I find student writers also can be relatively averse to uncertainty and kind of resistant to drawing contestable conclusions through arguments. So a skill I often grapple with teaching effectively is looking for evidence and reasons in general, rather than just those that support the conclusion the writer is predisposed to believe. So this talk is largely about the extent to which emerging technologies might exacerbate this problem. So this is my pit bull, Dinah, and I included her because I don't want to suggest that this is just a first year or student problem. It seems possible or likely that my own pit bull and my love of pit bulls drives much of my image generation choices when given the opportunity. So maybe it's not just this DALL-E suggestion, but stuff about me and my love of pit bulls. So even though teaching first-year argumentative writing made me interested in some of this, more generally, I've been curious about the extent to which emerging technologies, such as AI, exacerbate problematic tendencies we have as people, particularly when it comes to our tendency towards confirmation bias, where we only pay attention to evidence we are already likely to believe, and in my mind, related worrying trends such as political polarization. So my own sense is that increasing reliance on fast and easy information, a new kind of which is available through technologies such as large language models, does exacerbate these problems, and this is best understood by the ways these tools infringe on our intellectual autonomy and argumentative agency. So next, I'm just going to try to define intellectual autonomy and argumentative agency. So in some of Zagzebski's early work on intellectual autonomy, she focuses on intellectual self-reliance and trust of our intellectual selves. According to Zagzebski, intellectual autonomy is rational self-governance and requires management of the intellectual self. Management of the intellectual self requires self-trust to sort out conflicts in evidence or belief. So here are a couple of quotes directly from her. She says, the fundamental reason we trust evidence or reasons is that looking for evidence is what we do when we are self-reflective, and we trust that. I call the quality of using our faculties to the best of our ability in order to get to the truth epistemic conscientiousness. I think of this quality as the self-reflective version of the natural desire for truth. And she also says, autonomy requires trust in the connection between the conscientious use of all one's powers, perceptual, epistemic, affective, conative, and success in reaching the basic ends of those powers. More recently, Carter wrote a paper that specifically focuses on intellectual autonomy and extended cognition, which is the idea that our cognitive capacities can extend beyond our physical selves to include things like our smartphones. One of the things that I think he does nicely is demonstrate that intellectual autonomy is consistent with a kind of intellectual interdependence. So it is this self-reliance and self-trust, but also that doesn't exclude reliance on others. So for Carter, given the importance of our interdependence to have a good knowledge base, intellectual independence is contrasted with some sort of problematic epistemic dependence. So he says impressive intellectual self-direction and independence of thought without a suitable knowledge base from others, technology, the internet, etc., is effectively empty, whereas knowledge acquired in the absence of a suitable capacity for autonomous self-direction is blind. So from a virtue theoretic perspective, Carter construes autonomy as an excellence to be properly understood in contrast with vicious extremes. On the one hand, extreme independence cuts off knowledge resources, while complete dependence without any of one's own intellectual input represents the other extreme. As is consistent with much of virtue theory, intellectual autonomy is the excellence that represents the mean between those two extremes. So again, intellectual autonomy is not mere self-reliance, given the dependence we have on others, technologies, records, etc., to know things. It's more like a balance of using knowledge from a variety of sources in a way that's guided by the self through rational processes. Matheson's definition in his 2024 paper, Why Think for Yourself, further underscores this point. So his definition is as follows. The character virtue of epistemic autonomy characteristically involves dispositions, 1, to make good judgments about how and when to rely on your own thinking, as well as how and when to rely on the thinking of others, 2, to conduct their inquiry in line with those judgments, and 3, to do so because one loves the truth and appropriately cares about epistemic goods. So by contrast, we can think of the following things as cases of intellectual heteronomy: undue influence of others' belief on one's own, disregard of sources of knowledge, beliefs that are formed by inclination, fancy, or other problematic epistemic practices, and that are not supported by reasons. So with these initial considerations of intellectual autonomy in mind, I offer a tentative definition of argumentative agency that builds on intellectual autonomy and extends it to the practice of argumentation, which I understand is the social practice of exchanging reasons in search of conclusions. So here's what I'm trying out. An individual has argumentative agency when they are intellectually autonomous and have the basic abilities to exchange reasons in search of conclusions. This includes the ability to seek and evaluate evidence, the ability to evaluate connections between reasons and conclusions, the ability to articulate and defend conclusions, the ability to question evidence and conclusions, and argumentative consciousness building on Zagzebski's notion of epistemic conscientiousness. So using our faculties to the best of our ability to meet our argumentative goals. So just to tell you a little bit more of what I think of as argumentative goals, and I'd be curious what other people think about this. I think some argumentative goals might be seeking understanding, seeking consensus, seeking truth. I think the following things are not argumentative goals: manipulation, changing another's belief through some sort of coercion or trickery. So I think I have a relatively optimistic sense of what argumentative goals could be. Okay, so possible technological infringements on argumentative agency. I've come up with 3. Cognitive offloading might threaten our argumentative agency. Closed-mindedness might do so, and nudging. So starting with cognitive offloading. Cognitive offloading in this context can be understood as turning over cognitive work that a person might have done to a technological resource. One concern about cognitive offloading that Carter considers in his paper on intellectual autonomy and the extended mind is that through increasingly scaffolding our cognitive activities through technologies, we may lose those cognitive capacities. So he says, increasingly, in order to meet our cognitive goals, we tend to offload tasks traditionally performed through the use of our endowed biological faculties to technological gadgets with which we regularly and uncritically interact. Both high-tech cognitive offloading and reliance on medicine to achieve cognitive goals represent increasingly ubiquitous ways in which an individual's own intellectual agency can, at least potentially, become disconnected from the way she acquires and maintains her beliefs. So he suggests that one problem that may result from cognitive offloading is connected to the notion of learned helplessness. So meaning that in cognitive environments where certain tasks are completed by external mechanisms, we may lose the capacity to complete them ourselves. So some potential examples may include things like using technologies to remember things we have trouble remembering. We may lose the capacity and always rely on our technologies to provide these memories. Another potential example is language use. So if Google Docs will always create a high fidelity translation into different languages or dialects, perhaps my own linguistic skills will decline and I'll let technology do all of that work. And I might lose some capacity to gain linguistic skills. Okay, in another paper on the potential dangers of cognitive offloading, Turner imagines a near future in which implanted devices directly connect our minds and our information technologies. So the goal of Turner's paper is to anticipate both how such a future will likely impact epistemic virtue, and also to suggest policies and strategies that will help us avoid negative outcomes associated with the integration of neuromedia into our everyday lives. He's particularly concerned with how we might continue to cultivate intellectual perseverance, a virtue which allows us to persist in the face of cognitive obstacles in an era when technology might foster cognitive laziness, distraction, or passivity rather than perseverance. So the following is Turner's cognitive offloading argument. Premise 1, the cultivation and maintenance of intellectual virtue requires sustained active cognition on the part of the agent. Premise 2, cognitive offloading implies less active cognition, and when done in excess, can render agents cognitively lazy or at least cognitively passive. Conclusion, therefore, excessive cognitive offloading can impede the cultivation and maintenance of intellectual virtue by rendering agents cognitively lazy or at least cognitively passive. So Turner claims that some cognitive offloading, like using a calculator, is fine, but it's the excessive cognitive offloading which can become epistemically problematic. Ultimately, he concludes that the extent to which neuromedia threatens cognitive perseverance depends on how we use the technology. If we merely offload some menial cognitive tasks, there's little threat. But if we frequently offload substantive cognitive work, our ability to persevere will diminish. So the possibility of increased and substantive cognitive offloading seems to threaten all aspects of argumentative agency defined above, but particularly our intellectual autonomy and conscientiousness. The crux of the cognitive offloading argument is that we may be both less willing and less able to do important cognitive work as we increasingly integrate technology into our cognitive lives, and as we give more important intellectual tasks to that technology. As we do so, we will be using and trusting our own capacities less. This may lead not just to cognitive laziness, but also may exacerbate tendencies like closed-mindedness, given the way that personalization has become ubiquitous in our digital information spheres. That leads to the next concern about the way emerging technologies may impact our argumentative agency by fostering closed-mindedness through amplifying confirmation bias and concentrating filter bubbles. I think at one point I called this closed-mindedness and I changed it. So now it's confirmation bias and filter bubbles, which I think doesn't quite match up with what I had earlier, but similar sort of thing. Okay, so I'm going to start here by going back in time just a little bit for this part and think about search engines and their potential epistemic pitfalls, and then discuss how this is extended by AI tools. So in his 2012 paper evaluating Google as an epistemic tool, Simpson asks what are the epistemic functions of search engines, how we should assess them, and given the relevant assessment criteria, how they perform. So his answer to the first question is that the epistemic function of a search engine is a surrogate expert, because the role epistemically is to provide valuable sources. At the time of writing, Simpson claimed that search engines had two related epistemic functions. The first was navigational, which is the task of connecting a user with a source that they are seeking. The second, deeper task is identifying relevant and reliable sources, and that greater reliability is implied by the rank of results. So the ordering of sources and the presumption that more important sources are displayed first plays the role of judgment or evaluation of the sources delivered to the user performing the search. According to Simpson, internet search engines can perform their epistemic function well insofar as they are timely, promote legitimate authority and objectivity. While they can perform admirably on the first two criteria, given the increasing personalization of search engines, he argues that there's a threat to objectivity. And he says the following: personalization is the development in internet-delivered services consisting of tailoring online content to what will interest the individual user. But objectivity may require telling inquirers what they do not want to hear or are not immediately interested in. So personalization threatens objectivity. Simpson connects the threat of personalized search algorithms to our vulnerability to confirmation bias, which he describes as follows. And this is a quote: confirmation bias means that we are generally more likely to seek out testimony that supports our existing beliefs rather than testimony that contradicts it. So personalization of searches, according to Simpson, reinforces this bias, as continued searches will make it less and less likely that a user will be provided with alternative viewpoints, because the search engine will personalize it more and more, so they'll be just less and less likely to encounter alternative views. And this is the phenomenon known as filter bubbles. So while Simpson was focused on finding and weighting of sources, and this alone could cause for our cognitive lives given personalization, Simpson noted at the time of writing that search engines did not actually do the work of answering questions that users were asking. So I sometimes think of large language models as a kind of like multi-tool. So they can do searching, they're working on searching, they perform all these different functions. It can be like a dictionary, you can look up words, you can have it create a whole essay. So large language models go beyond search engines by, at minimum, appearing capable of directly answering questions, and sometimes doing so at least seemingly compellingly, even if they still create nonsense and ridiculous images, such as this image of a bike multi-tool from a image generator. Even if we should be careful about the output it produces, given that it makes weird things, like images of imaginary bike multi-tools that have, I think, an inexplicable leaf in it. When it comes to text, large language models often generate responses that, again, minimally seem compelling in a kind of large amount of cases. And even though Simpson argues that the personalization of search algorithms compromises objectivity, machine-generated responses still often seem objective to many users, given that there is apparently not an imperfect and biased human behind them. So this both increases the threat of cognitive offloading. We might be more likely to rely on the answers provided by large language models because they're quick and they tend to have at least a number of surface features which make them seem credible. And also further threats to objectivity in the form of creating more content that can reinforce the phenomena of confirmation bias, and presumably impacted by the prompts we give them that will likely follow that same phenomena. And I think we could very much see personalization being attached to AI in various ways. So reinforcing these phenomena of confirmation bias and filter bubbles. So reinforcement of confirmation bias and filter bubbles can negatively impact our argumentative agency by exacerbating cognitive weaknesses we tend to possess regarding gathering evidence, and can artificially strengthen our pre-existing beliefs by limiting access to other sources or ideas that would raise questions about the evidence or our evidence. This also might weaken our ability to question the evidence we have gathered and limit potential conclusions. And taken together, this further weakens our ability to use our faculties to the best of our ability. It may also be the case that with tools like large language models, we are less likely to do the work of investigating how reasons support conclusions and feed large language models prompts and have it do that work for us too. So the next section focuses on large-scale nudging and how technological nudges further reinforce technologically exacerbated cognitive offloading, confirmation bias, and weakens our autonomy in the intellectual practices that are essential to effective argumentation. So nudges and autonomy. So a nudge is typically defined roughly in the following way: a change in one's environment that tends to result in them behaving in predictable ways, but that's also theoretically really easy to resist. So one kind of example is placing healthy food in places where people are more likely to select it and make unhealthy choices more difficult. So if you had like a line of food, you put all the salad first and all the pizza at the end, because if you encounter the salad first, you're more likely to take it. I take my example of pit bulls in space from Dolly being a kind of nudge. It gave me some examples of what I might do, and now I just keep doing this thing that I actually enjoy very much too. Another kind of example, I followed the Giro d'Italia and Tadej Pogačar much more closely than I would have if I didn't have Instagram, because my algorithm is aware there of how much I like bikes, so it also thinks I really like bike racing. My watch telling me what runs to do to get ready for my marathon in October. Google and Apple directing my route to various locations. I don't really know if this last one counts as a nudge or not, but it comes to my mind. AI suggesting or creating written and argumentative forms, influencing both language choice and reasoning. So I think it clearly is a nudge when I get an email and Google or Outlook or something is like, is this what you want to respond? But on sort of larger scale things like suggesting reasoning, I'm curious if it gets to be more than a nudge. That's something we could talk more about later. All right, so autonomy and nudges. Kipper, in a 2021 paper, Irresistible Nudges, Inevitable Nudges, and the Freedom to Choose, argues that nudges can restrict our freedom in several ways, even if they are relatively easy to resist or overall beneficial and in line with our goals. So one way that they might be able to do so is by nudging us in ways that are misleading. So his example is this: alerting a driver to a dangerous curve by misleading the driver to believe that they are going faster than they are through road marking. So apparently if you have kind of lines on the road and you move them closer or closer together, you get the illusion that you're going faster than you are and tend to slow down. So in that case, it's misleading because you're getting inaccurate information about the speed you're going via this illusion, versus alerting the driver through signage. So just saying there's a dangerous curve ahead, and then the driver makes choices about whether they want to slow down or not. So according to Kipper, the former is a restriction on autonomy, so the lines coming closer and closer together, because it is misleading. While the latter, just putting information out there and the driver gets to make their choice, is not. So nudging by misleading, making it appear that one is driving at a faster speed than they are, versus providing information that will help them stay safe via signage, is one way that nudges can infringe on our intellectual autonomy. Personalization seems like a large-scale form of nudging that can restrict our intellectual autonomy and further reinforce cognitive offloading, as well as restricted information ecosystems that are chosen by technological systems rather than ourselves. So in a later 2023 chapter, Kipper focuses specifically on the potential large-scale effectiveness of digital nudges, given the ease of shaping digital environments in personalized ways based on large amounts of data. Furthermore, in digital environments, the goals of the nudges tend to be the benefit of the nudger, so the one creating the nudge, not the individual exposed to the nudge. So there's likely to be a large-scale mismatch between alignment of goals that negatively impacts intellectual autonomy. So even if the goals do happen to align and the nudges are beneficial, according to Kipper, if the origin of the goal comes from outside the individual, so even if there is that kind of goal alignment, he contends that our freedom is restricted by such outside influence because it's more the system that's creating those choices than the individual. So given these conclusions and the reliance of effective digital nudges based on large amounts of personal data, Kipper also concludes that the best way to ensure our continued freedom is to protect our privacy. So how do nudges impact our argumentative agency? If Kipper is right, large-scale personalized nudges driven by AI, even when aligned with our goals, limit our intellectual freedom and so may restrict our argumentative agency. The apparent effectiveness of nudging, especially when personalized, also exacerbates the previously discussed problems. For instance, if we are consistently nudged towards answers we are predisposed to believe in rather than exposed to wider debates, the quality of our evidence and our ability to evaluate it will be diminished. We will relatedly be less able to effectively question evidence and conclusions, and we will be less argumentatively conscientious because we will rely on our faculties less. So this is the last bit, just thinking about some potential reasons for optimism rather than pessimism in this domain. So some of the things that have been brought up in the literature are awareness of these digital environments and the potential problems can help us think about cultivation of intellectual virtues and also potential policy and kind of systemic change to avoid some of these problems. So again, we just saw with Kipper that our awareness of this kind of loss of intellectual freedom can motivate us to create better digital privacy policies and individual practices. For Turner, awareness of threats to intellectual perseverance can lead to moderating our practices of how we use digital tools, such that we reserve important cognitive labor for ourselves. For Carter, in conditions of cognitive integration, where there's sufficient endorsement and awareness on the part of the agent, digital tools can be sufficiently integrated into our intellectual character such that they actually don't present threats to intellectual freedom. My addition would be that in the face of emerging technologies and our awareness of how they impact our cognitive and argumentative lives, this might give us some good reason to take some more time with less studied virtues. So I spent some time thinking about patience, and a lot of this is motivated by our kind of high-speed informational lives, and also the quickness of some of these changes and how we might need to take an appropriate amount of time and not just jump on all these things really quickly. So there might be other things that we can think about more in terms of how our environments are being reshaped and how we can respond to it. So in conclusion, I've argued that emerging technologies such as AI tools create difficult to resist threats to our intellectual autonomy due to cognitive offloading. exploitation of cognitive weaknesses such as confirmation bias, and their ability to create large-scale personalized nudges that exacerbate these former two issues. And we may have reason to be hopeful because awareness of these problems creates opportunities for individual and systemic solutions. I think my own view is that the systemic solutions would probably be more effective, and I feel somewhat more skeptical that they are likely to be put in place. But I'm curious what you all think. So I am looking forward to questions. My last slide is just my references. So I'm going to stop sharing and take questions.